Max Prowant joining us now on the Sunrise Morning Show. He's a research fellow for In Defense of Christians. Max, welcome back.
Hi, good morning, Annie. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, and it's good to have you back. Now, you with the IDC, in conjunction with the Philos Project, you're hosting a panel discussion next week on how the differences of Shia and Sunni jihadism affect Christians. This is going to be taking place on Thursday, December the 8th at noon. You can go to indefenseofchristians.org to get more information. Okay, Max, so given that this is a panel discussion, tells me that we are definitely not going to be able to cover the differences on how Shias and Sunnis approach jihadism differently in a 5-7 minute interview. But I do want to get into that. But before we get into the specifics, just in general, how does understanding their theology help us to better protect Christians?
No, that's a very good question, yeah. So in the case of a group like ISIS, the Islamic State, understanding their theology was actually pretty critical in helping to, I don't want to say totally defeat them, but basically destroy the caliphate that they had going. Wow. Because they had a sort of very strict literalist understanding of what God wanted, of the holy text, of these various hadiths. And, they were not quiet about it. They shared their hadiths, they shared everything that they were sort of drawing from. So when it came to actually fighting them, we knew exactly the sorts of things that they were going to do. For example, that they believed an apocalyptic battle was going to take place in the fields of Dabiq, somewhere like that. Now, it gets a little more tricky when it's something like, Hezbollah or the IRGC. And this is partly of what the panel is going to try to get to. How does understanding the Shia sort of view of jihad help, protect vulnerable Christians, but also help defeat them? And when it comes to the Shia, I don't have a very clear, neat answer. I would just say, given that the Shia are much less prone to that sort of literalist exegesis, and because the Shia, at least in the 20th century, they really emphasize reason and this world, right, the goods of this world, they tend not to, at least with Khomeini and Hezbollah, they tend not to glorify, or how should we say it, martyrdom operations and suicide the same way that Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State did. Now, there's certainly some sort of traditions where they could, but in the most recent times, that's not what I'm seeing.
So interesting. I mean, we know that they go after each other. We hear about that in the news quite a bit. So do they go? Maybe go after is probably not the right way to phrase this, technically speaking. But do they go after Christians in a different way? Sounds like
yes,
Sunnis
absolutely.
are more aggressive.
Yeah, so I would say that, and this is sort of where the panel came out of, was the realization that Sunni jihadists tend to practice what we would typically think of as genocide, sort of mass murder, indiscriminate, just slaughter. You see this with ISIS in the Middle East. You see it with Boko Haram and ISWAP in West Africa, Nigeria, and even Al-Qaeda when it was, I guess AQI with Zarqawi. Whereas Hezbollah, they're not friends, or not just Hezbollah, but Shia jihadists, they're not friends of Christians by any means, but rather they prefer to just slowly push out Christian populations over time, maybe foment some dissent, foment some hostilities, but it's not quite the sort of open warfare and sort of targeted slaughter that we see with the Sunni jihadists generally.
Yeah, I remember when Pope Francis, when he visited Iraq, actually met with the Shiite Grand Ayatollah al-Sistani. So I guess that would, I mean, what do you make of that meeting between the two of them in terms of this discussion that we're having?
Oh, well, I don't remember quite all the details between that meeting, but I would say I don't think it's totally surprising that, well, let me say this. I'm not too familiar with Ayatollah Sistani's sort of general worldviews. Mm-hmm. I know that he's primarily, much of his concerns are sort of localized in Iraq. My sense, and this is just my own ignorance, I don't get the sense that he's ever been a advocate for sort of transnational jihad in the way that Ayatollah Khomeini or Ayatollah Fadlallah were. But I would say that even among those extremists, particularly Fadlallah, and no, not Khomeini, but Fadlallah, you do see much more of a willingness and desire for interfaith dialogue because they emphasize reason so much on the Shia side. That's not to say that a Sunni imam is not going to enter into dialogue, but it is to say that when it comes to those extreme groups, once you have entered the sort of arena of violence, you're much more likely to be able to have a discussion with the Shia extremist than you are with the Sunni.
Yeah. Well, this brings up an interesting question to close out our conversation. Just going back to you were talking about Iran. I'm sorry I brought in the Iraq Shia leaders. They're kind of shifting us away from the point here. But you mentioned, so you think about the threat that Hezbollah has, particularly when we talk to indefensive Christians, we're constantly hearing about that threat to Christians in Lebanon. And then, of course, so there's kind of this intellectual threat, and you said sort of this gradually pushing out Christians approach. And then you have kind of the, shall we say, more noticeable, these attacks that, they're flashes where, they get a lot of attention in a short amount of time. I mean, which poses a greater threat to Christians in the long run, do you think?
No, that's a very good question. I would say in the long run, it would seem to be that more gradualist Shia jihadist approach. And that's just because the Sunnis were, I don't want to say easy to defeat, but we have really clamped down on sort of Sunni jihadism, at least in the Middle East. There are still pockets, and they've shown that they can be very resilient and can regroup. But I'd say right now we're seeing a bigger threat just from the rise of Iran and the persistence of groups like Hezbollah, which, let's remember, Hezbollah has been sort of operational for 30 or 40 years now. And the damage it's done to Lebanese Christians is, oh gosh, we see it today.
Yeah, we do. We've been talking to Max Pro, and it sounds like this is going to be a really, really interesting panel discussion. Go to indefenseofchristians.org to get more information. Again, taking place on Thursday, December the 8th, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception at noon. And you can find In Defense of Christians linked at sunrisemorningshow.com. Max, thank you so much.
Thank you, Annie. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you.